What's up, Ninja Nerds? In this video today, we're going to talk a little bit about cancer screening. So we've talked individually about things like breast cancer, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, which involve a lot of different discussions on screening, trying to be able to catch cancer before it unfortunately is diagnosed at a stage 3, stage 4. And that's where a lot of these things come into discussing with the patient their particular risk factors, talking about their history, their family history, and really deciding, okay, based upon your risk, is it average? Is it high risk? Do you carry specific genetic mutations that put you at risk for this cancer? And then obviously, depending upon that, determines what kind of screening that you will do using a specific modality, and then how frequently you'll do it. And obviously, depending upon the specific type of risk factor, you may have to do that very frequently. And sometimes if it's kind of a lower risk, you may be able to span that out. We talked about all of those high risk scenarios in each individual type of lecture on these specific cancers. The primary goal of this lecture is to really give you an overview to say, okay, if I took the average risk individual who carried a specific risk for things like lung cancer, breast cancer, etc., what age would I screen them? How frequently would I screen them? And what modality would I use to screen that patient? Let's talk about that today, just to give a quick little reminder and recap of these concepts. All right, so let's start first. When we talk about screening guidelines, we'll focus here first on colorectal cancer. So with colorectal cancer, obviously with this, we want to talk about what is the age range. And we're going to kind of base this off what the USPSTF states. And we go with the age of 45 to 75 years of age. Within that age range, depending upon these patients who carry this average risk, we should be screening them with what particular type of modality. And it depends. So for some patients, they may not want to get the gold standard, which is a colonoscopy. They might prefer something like a FIT, which is a fecal immunochemical test, or an FOBT, a fecal occult blood test. So these are simple tests where you take a stool sample and you'll run it through this like little test strip. And basically what it'll do is you'll have little antibodies that'll be able to detect specific types of proteins, things like hemoglobin, which could be in blood, that could detect that there is blood within the stool. But that doesn't tell you that the patient has colon cancer. It just says, hey, there's some occult blood in the stool. Maybe we should evaluate this with a colonoscopy. This is a really good test. I'd say it's a little bit more sensitive than a fecal occult blood test, but a fecal occult blood test can do the similar concept. You take a stool sample, you put it onto this little slide, you put a testing solution on this, and all it's going to tell you is based upon this, does it show that there is the presence of blood or occult blood in the stool? Again, if the patient didn't want to get a colonoscopy, you could do these yearly to survey them. And if they came up abnormal, what would you do then? Then you should pursue a colonoscopy, especially if the patient has associated symptoms, right? Things like maybe abdominal pain, maybe changes in their bowel habits, right? On top of that, maybe they've had experienced weight loss. And maybe they have anemia or iron deficiency anemia. These are things that I think all with that should push a patient to get a colonoscopy. But these are some pretty decent tests. Now, another one that's been kind of incorporated, and you can potentially extend it out a little bit longer than a year, is a FIT DNA test. It's called the Cologuard test. It's honestly, when you take the fecal occult blood test, all you're looking to detect is red blood cells that are present in the stool. When you look at a FIT test, you're looking to detect proteins in the stool specific to blood. So things like, hemoglobin. With a test, particularly like a FIT DNA test, you are literally trying to find specifically DNA. And when I be more specific is, you can find red blood cells, but you're looking to find DNA mutations that are more suggestive of a patient having colorectal cancer, at being at increased risk of colorectal cancer. So that's another test that we could incorporate. So if I said fecal occult FIT test, you could do that yearly. If I said a FIT DNA, you would push that to maybe every 3 years. All right. Now, again, if that Cologuard came back positive, you should then say, hey, let's do a colonoscopy. But it came up negative, you can come back and do it again in 3 years. A CT colonography is another alternative test. It's kind of interesting, but again, you expose the patient to radiation. All you're doing is you're getting a CT scan. And so you get a CT scan of the abdomen. And what you'll do here is you can kind of appreciate there is some weird appearing kind of polyps or nodules. This technology can then kind of invert them into like a 3-dimensional image, and we can kind of trace around and find specific abnormalities. So you can appreciate here on this 3D colonography, you can see that there's these two weird areas that we can appreciate on this tracing of the colon. And then when we zoom in on it utilizing this technology, we we can see, hey, there's definitely some abnormal kind of polyps appearing. And we can also appreciate that here on the CT scan. This would then say, we have something abnormal, we should investigate this and get a colonoscopy. But if it came back normal, you could potentially push this and say, hey, let's do another one in 5 years, right? A flexible sigmoidoscopy is one that can be utilized. I'd say it's less common. We see this more in patients who carry an APC or what we call FAP condition, so familial adenomatosis polyposis. They have risks of developing, hundreds upon thousands of polyps within their descending and sigmoid colon. And so in these patients, it's best to go and evaluate that particular area where that APC mutation tends to really resonate. And so with that, because it's involving more of the descending and sigmoid colon, you don't have to do a colonoscopy where you travel throughout the entire colon. You could just keep it primarily focused in on the descending and the sigmoid and stop kind of near that splenic flexure area. And that's where we would say a flexible sigmoidoscopy would be potentially beneficial. And so you'll take this kind of scope and maybe there's going to be a polyp here in that descending colon. You're only going to go in and focus on this area. So it's kind of like a very narrowed, kind of like boiled down colonoscopy where you're only focusing on the most distal portion of the colon. All right. And that's something that you can consider in every 5 years as well. Now, colonoscopy is going to be the gold standard. So if you get an exam question that says you have a patient who's 45 to 75 years of age, they carry an average risk of colorectal cancer, we should be screening them. What modality should you be doing? And you can do it less frequently is a colonoscopy. Now, when I say we do it less frequently, you can do it every 10 years, but that's if it's completely normal. If there's some concerning features, maybe a little bit of you have some polyps, maybe you have some kind of weird appearing adenomas or some high-grade dysplasia, you may have to come back every 3 or 5 years. But if it's pretty good and you got nothing really concerning, you can extend that out to 10 years. A colonoscopy is you are literally visualizing the entire colon. You're running the rectum, the sigmoid, the descending, the transverse, the ascending colon. You are traversing that whole entire area to look for any abnormal kind of pictures. Now, if you go through that and you say, oh my gosh, I found cancer in the descending colon, or I found it in the sigmoid colon, or I found it in the rectum. Again, you may diagnose that condition and then you kind of go down a different pathway of determining, okay, what's their overall T&M staging? What's the next step? Should we kind of refer them to get some type of surgical procedure? Should we start them on chemotherapy, etc.? But if it comes back normal, you can again push this study out to every 10 years. And so that's something I want you guys to really remember. All right, for breast cancer, this is again focusing on the average risk individual. We determine this, if you guys remember, we do something called a Tyrer-Cuzick score. There's different modalities that you can use, but I think that tends to be the most validated one. And we go with less than 20% or greater than equal to 20%. For those that carry that average risk, a mammogram is your primary modality. And again, the USPSTF just changed the actual guidelines where it used to be 50 to 74. Now we actually push it to 40 to 74 years of age. And when we do this mammogram, again, you are looking at this and you're getting what I would say is it's not diagnostic, right? It's a preventative mammogram where it's going to be kind of just looking at general views of the breast and seeing if they can identify any types of abnormalities based upon its BI-RADS score. And determining on that, you may then need to get a diagnostic mammogram. You may need to go further and get other additional tests. And so that's really, really important to remember. So mammogram is going to be the test of choice here. And again, frequency is about every 2 years. So let's say that you get a mammogram, you find this abnormal lesion and its BI-RADS score is pretty high. In that scenario, depending upon this, yes, you may need to do a repeat diagnostic mammo, but the more likely potential scenario, if you see a pretty abnormal lesion like this, is you need to proceed with a core needle biopsy. And so that's something to consider is, again, based upon the finding, we may have to go and biopsy this. But if it comes back completely normal, we can push this and say, hey, why don't you come back in 2 years? And so that would be the particular guidelines for those who carry that average risk of breast cancer. Cervical cancer is going to be something that a lot of patients are at risk for. HPV is a very prevalent infection out there, and when you look at the actual incidence of HPV infections and cervical cancer, it's very, very high. So there's a pretty significant relationship between the two. And then we talk about HPV, and usually we try to keep this to where we don't go in too young of an age, right? The people who tend to be highest risk for this is those who have very frequent sexual partners, a lot of unprotected sex, they're immunosuppressed, and they don't have that immune system capable of fighting off HPV. So we like to keep this around like that 21-year range. And then from there, we should continue to be screening them almost all the way up till about 65 years of age. The way that we do this is because it can affect the cervix. is we'll start off, let's say that we go 21 to 29 years of age. We do something called a pap smear. All you're going to be doing in this is you're going to be taking and doing a speculum exam. You're going to take a little brush and you're going to then rotate that to get some of the cells around that cervix. And then from there, you're going to collect those, send those off to the pathology lab and figure out what does it come back with. Does it come back with low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions? Does it come back with high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions? Does it come back with atypical glandular cells? These are things that kind of determine, if it did, I need to go a different route. I may need to do things like a colposcopy. I may need to do a biopsy. And so these are things to definitely consider. But let's say that you do it completely normal. We don't see anything concerning, or maybe it's a low grade. You could then say, hey, let's do it every 3 years from that, right? If you have somebody who's 30 to 65, you can give them an option where they don't have to come back and get these pap smears as frequently. You can do a pap smear every 3 years, or you can do a pap smear plus an HPV test, which is once you take the cells, you send that off to see if any of those cells are infected with HPV 6 and 11. If it comes back positive for one of those genotypes, then it's a little bit more concerning. We're probably going to have to do some type of colposcopy and biopsy, right, to determine if there is any kind of abnormal lesions. So that's something I would definitely say that's really, really important to remember. But if it comes back normal, you can potentially push this every 5 years. All right, cool with that one. Next one is lung cancer. Lung cancer is really important that for this, it's usually going to be very specific. The age range is about 50 to 80 years of age, but we want this in patients who actually have the particular risk factors. What is that? Smoking. So those who smoke, and generally we say that it's got to be a specific number of pack years, and that's usually greater than or equal to 20 pack year history. And if you're a current smoker or you quit within the last 15 years, you need to get a low dose chest CT. The whole point of this is being able to identify things like small pulmonary nodules or small pulmonary lesions before they become very large, unfortunate cancers, things like squamous cell or small cell that can be pretty much devastating and metastasize really early. So that's why 50 to 80, you smoke 20 pack a year or greater, and current or quit within the past 15 years, you need to get a low dose chest CT. And we do that annually. Now, if it came back and you saw something like this is really concerning. If I saw something like this, I'm probably going to push to go and get a biopsy. If it was something where the patient had all of the appropriate risk factors, this one is very abnormal. It's irregular. It's got kind of a spiculated appearance. It's very large. For this one, and depending upon the location, usually with these upper lobes are pretty concerning, I'd push to get a biopsy. Now, if you were like, I don't know, should I do a biopsy? Because with biopsies, they carry risk. You probably have to do something like a VATS or a CT-guided FNA. Obviously these kinds of things carry risk. Or CT-guided biopsy would be a thing that you'd have to consider because this is a little bit more peripheral. Usually if it's a little bit more central, you can perform things like a bronchoscopy with a biopsy, but oftentimes when they're kind of towards the peripheral lobes of the lungs, you may have to do things like a VATS, you may have to do a CT-guided biopsy. And then usually if they're involving the pleura, you can potentially tap into that pleural fluid and test it for any kind of like malignant cells by checking the cytology. And if you get a bloody tap, that kind of gets a little concerning too. But either way, I think for this one, you'd have to commit to doing a biopsy. So sometimes if it's like, I don't know, you can do things like a PET scan, and that would show potentially increased FDG uptake, and that may push you to do a biopsy, right? But I think anything that's usually pretty decent size, greater than 8 millimeters, usually upper lobe, irregular, spiculated, something like this, I'd probably go straight to doing a biopsy, right? But if it came back normal, you could do this just every year, all right? And so that's something to definitely consider. Now, prostate cancer is kind of a controversial one when it comes to screening these patients because, believe it or not, we do have an age range which this tends to be more common in. It's usually 55, 69 years of age. But I'd say that this is kind of like, it's a shared decision-making process. And what I mean by that is that those who are usually African-American, 55 and older, and they have a family history of prostate cancer, those patients should be screened with a PSA level. For those who are 55, they're not African-American, they usually don't have any particular family history, that's when you would talk to them and say, hey, we can do a PSA level. And if it comes back a little elevated, like greater than 4, we can consider repeating it if it's abnormal. But the problem is that sometimes that leads down an undesirable rabbit hole and you push them to get biopsies and tests that they shouldn't actually get. And so that's why it's important to kind of talk to these patients and make sure that you have a good, predictive value, positive predictive value that says, hey, that this patient does carry a pretty high risk and I want to make sure that I don't, miss this too late. And we identify this without putting them through the unnecessary tests. So 55 to 69, but I would add in there those who have a family history, African American ethnicity carries that pretty good risk. And I would check a PSA level. If you tend to check it at 55 to 69, they don't have those risk factors, that's fine. Just remember, a PSA is not the end all be all. Combining it with things like a DRE to see if you feel any kind of abnormal kind of areas along the prostate that are kind of like usually enlarged but non-tender kind of appearing, that would maybe kind of concern me a little bit. Sometimes you can have a completely normal DRE, you can have elevated PSA, but there's other conditions that can elevate the PSA. That's why you really want to be careful. And so that's why sometimes when we talk about these, it's really talking with the patient and making sure that they're agreeable to this. Because once you get that elevated PSA, you may need to go down the route of getting an MP-MRI. You may have to go down the route of getting a transrectal ultrasound with a biopsy. You're putting them through procedures that they may or may not need. So it's important to talk to them about that. But generally with this one, it's not kind of a, you do this yearly, every 2 years, every 3, no. You kind of just do it based upon the actual decision making between the patient. And that's why I added this one in. It's kind of controversial, but I want to consider it since we talked about this in an individual lecture. All right, the last one is hepatocellular carcinoma. The big thing to remember about this one is we talked about this in the pancreatic and hepatobiliary cancers, but I think the big thing to remember is that this should be considered in a patient who has cirrhosis or who has chronic hepatitis B virus infection, or if they have both. Either way, if they have these conditions, that puts them inherently at a risk of developing hepatocellular carcinoma. And the way that we screen for that is with a ultrasound and an AFP level. Usually if an ultrasound shows a kind of an abnormal, kind of like adenoma, or an abnormal appearing solitary mass, that should be very, very concerning, especially if the AFP level is high, greater than or equal to 20. Those are concerning features. But again, it's just adding in this like little extra one where if I have a concern, patient has cirrhosis, have Hep B, I want to screen for hepatocellular carcinoma, you need to do an ultrasound. That's the key thing, and AFP could be an additional one. And we do this every 6 months. All right, and here you can kind of appreciate that this person has a history maybe of cirrhosis or hepatitis B virus. They got an ultrasound and it found this kind of solitary mass that was concerning. And that could be concerning for hepatocellular carcinoma. All right, wow, that was a ton of information on these different types of screening guidelines. And again, this is meant to really focus on the average risk individual and talking about those particular types of cancers that if we can potentially identify these with the proper modality early, we can catch something before it's developed into some kind of terrible stage 3, stage 4 illness. So I really, really hope that this made sense. I hope that you guys liked it. I hope that you learned a lot. And if you did, please take the time to hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and subscribe. And man, I just love you guys. I thank you guys so much. And as always, until next time.